Baik, mohon izin Bapak Ibu, kita akan memulai rangkaian acara. Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin our seminar. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Good afternoon. The Honorable Director General of Budget Financing and Risk Management, Ministry of Finance of Republic of Indonesia, Bapak Luki Alfirman, Director, Head of International Policy Group, Central Bank of Indonesia, Bapak Haris Munandar, our prominent panelists and moderators, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you to Yogyakarta at collaborative seminar between the Indonesian G20 Presidency and G20 Engagement Groups Business 20, Think 20, and Urban 20 with a topic of advancing sustainable and inclusive infrastructure investment. It is an honor for me, Dodi Seftariza, to be your host or master of ceremony for today's agenda. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let us take a quick recap of today's program. We will begin with an opening remark by Director General of Budget Financing and Risk Management, Ministry of Finance of Republic of Indonesia, and after the remarks, we will start our panels. Please note that there will be two sessions of panels. The opening session will be delivering inclusive economic recovery and development through sustainable infrastructure financing. In this panel, we will discuss the various related initiatives relating to sustainable infrastructure and opportunities for action and implementation. It includes how this effort can help countries to achieve inclusive economic recovery and how this can be replicated. And for the second panel, the topic will be leveraging private capital to enhance social inclusion through subnational infrastructure. We will discuss about potential action that can be utilized to overcome financing challenges for subnational governments. A case study from Jakarta City will demonstrate a collaborative effort to deliver inclusive infrastructure at a subnational level. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin our seminar. May we now invite the Honorable Bapak Luki Alfirman, Director General of Budget Financing and Risk Management, Ministry of Finance of Republic of Indonesia, to give his opening remarks.
Very good afternoon, selamat siang, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Distinguished speakers, participants, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Luki Alfirman, Director General of Budget Financing and Risk Management from the Indonesian Ministry of Finance. My apologies that I cannot come in person today due to the agenda with our Parliament. It's an honor for me to welcome you to Yogyakarta for the seminar on advancing sustainable and inclusive infrastructure investment. This seminar is convened with the strong collaboration between the Indonesian G20 Presidency and G20 Engagement Group. We, therefore, would like to thank Business 20, Think 20, and Urban 20 for their support in preparing this seminar. Sustainable and inclusive infrastructure is a priority agenda for the Infrastructure Working Group under the 2022 Indonesia G20 Presidency, where my team, Pak Brahmantio, act as a co-chair for the presidency. We are happy to be here today to listen to various experiences in delivering sustainable and inclusive infrastructure, from the perspective of governments, private, and academics. The COVID-19 pandemic has had unprecedented massive adverse effects on many sectors, including infrastructure. It disrupted the investment flow into infrastructure, as government necessarily diverted their resources to protect the life of their citizens. This year conditions have become even more challenging due to the recent development in the Ukraine, which is having an impact on food, energy, and finance. This will hinder our efforts to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Agenda and climate change goals. To achieve our climate change goals, action from all parties involved, both government and private sectors, are required, particularly to increase sustainable infrastructures, which can play a key role in achieving economic recovery and long-term sustainable economic growth. To facilitate this, one area of our focuses in the G20 this year is to leverage private participation in sustainable infrastructure investment. Private sector's participation will be critical to overcoming the significant infrastructure gap and will complement investment from other sources, including public investment. Inclusivity is also an important area of focus for the G20 this year. The uneven impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic has created high discrepancies among regions and countries. It has worsened the poverty rates and inequalities, particularly in vulnerable groups and underserved regions. Subnational governments are responsible for fulfilling around 60% of infrastructure needs. The investment needs to be sped up to improve our ability to provide high-quality, accessible, and affordable infrastructure services. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, advancing infrastructure towards more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient has not only become a priority globally, but it is also a key priority domestically in Indonesia. As a country subject to the impacts of climate change, Indonesia has ratified its commitment to achieve the Paris Agreement target through the Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDCs, where Indonesia is committed to reducing greenhouse gas emission of 29% with its own capabilities and 41% with international support in 2030. Indonesia has some initiative on the sustainable agenda and enhancing subnational developments. It ranges from policies, government support, and government instruments. We have a PPP framework. We have SDG Indonesia 1 as a platform for blended financing in delivering sustainable infrastructure. We have SDG instruments such as SDG bond and Green Sukuk or Syariah bond. And we also provide support for regional governments in delivering infrastructure. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, now let us share one of our efforts in promoting infrastructure while ensuring the green and sustainable agenda are also addressed. If you, delegates and participants, came to Yogyakarta via Yogyakarta International Airport and traveled to the city by the airport train, you already experienced and felt the benefits of the sustainable infrastructure we have developed. The airport train brings benefit, particularly in accelerating local economic growth by providing easier access to Yogyakarta. It shortened the traveling time from 1.5 hours to only 40 minutes to reach Yogyakarta, and also provided jobs to 57,300 people during its construction. The project also accelerates the efficiency and effectiveness of the transportation system in Yogyakarta, as it is connected with other transportation modes. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, through this seminar, we hope we can learn what else we can do to improve our way of developing policies, managing our support, and enriching our instruments by listening to other countries' experiences, business perspectives, and from the view of the researchers or academics. We also hope today's discussion will support the implementation of our effort in Infrastructure Working Group framework on leveraging private sector participation to scale up sustainable infrastructure investment and policy toolkit to mobilize funding and financing for inclusive and quality infrastructure investment in regions and cities. You will hear today that these issues cut right across the G20 agenda. It is not only the infrastructure agenda who has been considering these issues. They have also been a focus of the G20 engagement group here today. I believe that today's seminar will reaffirm that sustainable infrastructure and addressing subnational disparities is achievable. Learning from speakers' experiences in delivering policies, programs, and projects will assure members and participants that the G20 agenda is actionable and replicable. From the G20 perspective, we do hope from the engagement group that the seminar is not only seen as a venue to show our collaboration, but also to get your view and support on how we can start applying the G20 agenda to future projects. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, many areas will be discussed during this important event. I hope you will all enjoy and have fruitful discussion. Also, not to forget, please enjoy your stay in Yogyakarta. I will stop right here and thank you. Terima kasih, keep safe and stay healthy. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Bapak Lucky Alfirman, for the opening remarks. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we will shortly begin the panel discussion. As I mentioned before, at first session, we will discuss about delivering inclusive economic recovery and development through sustainable infrastructure financing. Before we start, let me introduce our moderator, Mr. Henry Blas. Mr. Henry is a Chief Content Officer at the Global Infrastructure Hub. He is a GI Hub representative at the G20 Infrastructure Working Group and at G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. He's also responsible for GI Hub's online data, research tools, and products. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Mr. Henry Blas. Please give big round of applause.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope the microphone seems to work, so it's good. I'm very, very happy to sort of be able to moderate a session where we're going to discuss about inclusive economic recovery. So today we have something a little bit special, which is a completely virtual panel. So unfortunately, you're only going to see me on stage. This is not a TED Talk. We're going to hear from many more people, not just me. So the great panelists that we're going to get today, and I think many of them will be able to articulate exactly like Lucky Afirman was saying, how it is actually feasible to create that inclusive economic recovery through infrastructure. So we're going to hear from many distinguished panelists. We're going to hear from Ms. Andrea Azeredo. She's from BNDES, which is the Brazilian Development Bank. And special thanks to her because it's 3 a.m. in Brazil at the moment, so I think it's real commitment. On the T20 side, we're going to hear from Ms. Freda Jansson and Ms. Cynthia Rosalie. They both one from African Center for Economic Transformation, and Ms. Cynthia Rosalie is from PLN, so obviously very well versed into the energy challenges and opportunities. On the B20 side, we're going to get Mr. Raju Munusamy, he's policy manager at the Finance and Infrastructure Task Force and also a partner at PwC Indonesia. And last but not least, on the U20 side, so on the city side, we're going to have the pleasure to hear both from Transfer from London, but also from Barcelona City Council through Mr. Stephen Dadswell and Mr. Alvaro Loscos. So again, all of them are virtual, and I think that it looks like everyone is online, which is great to see. So I'm not going to go through. I think you all had the. I mean, the paper sort of explain what each group is doing, but we definitely want to hear from those distinguished panelists on how it is actually feasible, again, to have this inclusive recovery. On my end, when it comes to the G20, the key deliverable this year is the framework on how to accelerate private investment, financing into sustainable infrastructure, and through that work, in collaboration with all the countries, we sort of went through some of the key aspects that really enable private investment in infrastructure. The good planning, and I think we're going to hear some great examples on that, standards and definition, enabling environment, which is actually critical, and innovation as well, both from a technology perspective, but also from a finance perspective. So again, I think I will let the panelists present what they're doing with their own group as we ask them a couple of questions. So first, I'm going to ask a couple of questions to the panelists, and then after that, the floor will be open for anyone here to ask questions. So let me first. Looks okay. Like we have everyone on board. So the first question I'm going to ask is to Andrea Azeredo from BNDES. Just want to check, because I think there were some issues earlier on, that the sound is working?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you, Harry.
Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. So my first question would be really sort of how can the public and the private sectors better collaborate and coordinate with each other to close the infrastructure gap and scale up sustainable infrastructure financing?
Well, thank you for the question, Harry. And I would also like to thank the organization of the event for the invitation to talk and share BNDES experience today. BNDES approach to this question was to acknowledge that a fundamental step in Brazil to attract the private sector was to have a strong pipeline of well-structured projects to ensure scale, consistency, and good investment opportunities. So with that in mind, the bank adapted its strategy in the past years to also become a service provider and developed what we call the Projects Factory, which is a project preparation unit to gain the scale never seen in Brazil before. I'm not sure if we'll be able to show some slides, but I can share with you some data on our portfolio. And the concept is that the Project Factory, combined with the financial solutions that BNDES traditionally provides, could generate more development, scaling up the investment opportunities in infrastructure. I'm not sure we have the slide presentation. I don't think we're gonna be able to show, but basically, BNDES, what I wanted to show is that BNDES has been ranked in, let me see if that's the one.
We have the slides.
Yeah, we can go to the next slide, please. So this slide shows the scale that we reached. BNDES was ranked by Infralogic as the largest infrastructure project structure globally. And this includes the pipeline that we developed since 2019. In the next slide, we can have an overview of the diversified portfolio we built. And it includes a number of different levels of governments as clients. We have the federal level, we have states and municipalities. And we also have a diverse portfolio of sectors, which includes basically logistics. We have over 14,000 kilometers in projects under structuring, ports, we have social projects, power, real estate. We have sanitation sector. Our projects are actually transforming the lives of the population. We already impacted 17 million people with the auction project so far, and another 17 million under structuring. In total, it's over 180 projects out of 22 in 2019, and over $80 billion in investments, mobilized investments, of which more than half we already auctioned. We also have what we call the environmental assets, which includes forests and parks. It represents now about 12 million hectares. It's an area larger than Portugal, just to give you an idea of the size. And we are basically creating a new asset class in opening a new route for sustainable investment with this new asset class. Well, I'll stop for now, and I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Andrea. And I mean,
I have a couple of other slides that I think we can address in the next round of questions.
Thank you. We'll have other questions for you, so you'll have an opportunity to share more. And clearly, I mean, it's great to see how the government can play a critical role, and actually a very successful role, in bringing private sector into infrastructure, and BNDES is really, really sort of top-notch on that. So we've heard from on the government side. Now I'm going to turn to Mr. Raju Munusamy on the B20 side, and if you could tell us, obviously one of the priorities of the Finance and Infrastructure Task Force is to improve access to affordable and suitable sources of financing for infrastructure. So what have been the thoughts of the B20 and the business community more generally regarding what more needs to be done to scale up the amount of financing for infrastructure?
Yes, thank you, Henry. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me start by answering this question. So first of all, let's put some context, try to understand the context first. Well, infrastructure investments by the private sectors are not taking place at the scale desired, because first one is there's a mismatch, or let's call it imbalance, between risk and return for the investors. Many projects that are intended for this private financing do not exactly offer an attractive risk-return profile for private investors, or sometimes it's not even feasible if financed on purely commercial terms. Now, to balance the risk and return profile, it is then necessary to ensure that project risks are allocated to the party best able, one to appraise, to manage, and also to mitigate each risk appropriately, right? So that at the end of it, the returns are matching with the risk. Given that infra investment is a long-term financing or investment, a meaningful level of return then become critical at the equity level. And this is what is going to unlock significant sources of financing. So one is, again, going back to risk return profile, and second one is attractive enough to be made into long-term investment. Now, as far as the business community feels, there is insufficient, so-called investment-ready projects, and this is what Andrea also alluded earlier. And where there may be infrastructure financing available, and the private sector wants to invest, the project creation lagging behind the investors' demand, and therefore that interest will just wane off. So how do you attract private financing? Well, first, there has to be the pipelines of properly prepared, consistently structured, and effectively sequence those projects in a form of a pipeline, so that investors can understand the government's level of commitment and also the priority. By having this robust pipelines of deals coming up, this is crucial for private sector, and also will give greater confidence for developers and also for investors, since they need to allocate resources to a certain country. This pipeline will also unlock the scale. If you have a one-off transaction, highly customized, the commercial structure is also customized. This is less attractive to bidders because there's a limited chance of success. And in addition, one-off opportunities may not justify cost for the private investors to conduct a due diligence or planning to enter a new country. However, in many countries, there is a lack of transparency, coordination, and continuity in developing and managing this infrastructure projects pipeline. The third one is one of the topics that has been discussed a lot, especially in this current B20 policy recommendation, is blended finance. Blended finance structures effectively can help mobilize private sector finance because you're mitigating specific risk and rebalancing risk-reward profiles of private players, depending on the on who they are, what kind of risk return profile they expect. So you effectively can use pools of public or concessional funds and mix it with the commercial funds, and then that will reduce or lower the expected return. In developing countries, especially, the successful implementation of blended finance requires, collaboration between various stakeholders, whether it's governments, the MDBs, the investors, institutional investors, financial investors, and so on. This will improve the investment climate, and this is exactly what the business community is hoping for. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for highlighting. I think some of the key aspects are required, especially in emerging economies. And first, obviously on your list was the risk management, and I think that's where, to your point, project preparation, blended finance are sort of solutions that we want to sort of scale. And so, talking on sort of emerging countries and the challenges there, can I turn now to Ms. Freda Jansson? Obviously, you have a lot of experience in Africa, but I think through the work of the G20, especially on the TF8, I mean the objective was stronger economic recovery through inclusive, resilient, and greener infrastructure investment and financing. So from that work, what recommendations to the G20 governments have been developed to accelerate this recovery through sustainable infrastructure financing?
Thank you so much. And also pleasure to be here. And thank you for the opportunity to speak on this. From the T20 perspective, like you said, some colleague organizations, ASET, OECD, and AFIDA, looked at a number of recommendations, 3 in particular, but also similar to the context that Raju just explained. I think, especially in developing countries, the financing gap is even wider. We realized that about 77% of private finance was mobilized in middle-income countries. So then you ask yourself, what's happening in developing countries, and why is this an issue? Well, we found that asset managers identified challenges like small deal sizes, securities that were dominated in local currency, poor credit ratings, and so on and so forth. The issues of risk that the previous speaker just alluded to. And so as we looked at these issues, we thought about 3 areas. First, taking regional and local approaches to the expansion of infrastructure. Secondly, improving project preparation and financing, alternative financing mechanisms, and then also looking at policy frameworks to promote local ecosystem development and diffusing innovation. So if I look at the regional approaches, I think first of all, on the African continent, for instance, but also in other regions, there are a number of initiatives ongoing. G20 Compact for Africa, the PIDA, PAP2, for instance, who are working on regional corridors for structuring infrastructure. All of these, aligning with some of these efforts, will help our private sector sort of minimize and reduce some of the risk that they might otherwise see, working individually at the national level. Secondly, we can facilitate supporting solutions, policy that through policy dialogue and experience sharing that encourage not just top-down approaches, but also bottom-up approaches to infrastructure. So, there have been successes in smaller community-led infrastructure, for instance, in digital, where bigger companies can't go to rural areas. And so you have partnerships between, larger financiers and, smaller communities. And we can also look at infrastructure sharing models, which have been piloted, already for electricity and water infrastructure, and can be expanded to newer areas like digital. Secondly, from our perspective also, one of the key challenges is project preparation. Raju talked about, building the pipeline, and from what we saw is that a lot of countries lack the capacity, the local expertise in project preparation to develop those investment-ready projects. And so, what the G20 could contribute to, for instance, are provision of, templates, knowledge-sharing platforms, and so forth. Another unique idea that came from our colleagues at AFIDA was, especially in developing countries, the timeline could be about, 3 times longer than international projects. And what happens as a result is that, you lose the learning in the process as financiers become impatient. And so one of the approaches could be to develop incubators for infrastructure, local private sector startups, just to help them get these projects investment ready before financiers are brought in. And then finally, when you get to policy frameworks and ecosystem development, I think that there are a number, again, of initiatives that can be aligned. From the African perspective, we know that, the AFCTA is now a great vehicle for trade and promoting infrastructure projects as well. So aligning sort of these disparate efforts, as well as disparate even standards and regulatory practices. So on the continent, you have, you've got the Chinese doing infrastructure, you've got Americans, you've got a lot of different partners coming with different standards and regulatory practices. Meanwhile, out on NAPAD and PETA also have, a quality infrastructure framework. So how do we align these in such a way that countries are not being torn with so many decisions and practices to choose from? And then finally, I think that, in areas where you're looking at data, for instance, digital infrastructure, you have some imbalance between data producers and where countries are collected. And so there needs to be sort of a shift which allows countries to have more control over some of these areas of how their data is used and so forth. And all of that can come through, policy frameworks that set these things in motion. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure we can discuss more later.
Thank you, and a lot to unpack here. I think definitely on the regionalization and regional approach, I think we're going to hear from BNDES how they actually created a sort of regional pipeline. So I'm not going to cover that. I think we're going to hear, but I think there's lots lovely aspect that you mentioned that I actually covered in a framework work that we have done this year, in particularly not creating too many sort of frameworks that makes it very difficult for countries in Africa and elsewhere because they have to deal with literally sort of 50 standards and various sort of requirements. So definitely something that the G20 has sort of taken to heart and would like to progress going forward. So I'm just going to stay with the T20 and now move closer to home and PLN. So Ms. Cynthia Wesley, based on experience in infrastructure financing, how to scale up the initiative, sustainable infrastructure financing in Indonesia, in particular in the energy sector.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. So good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to some of the colleagues, which in different time dimension. So probably before answering the questions, as part of the T20 thematic coordinators, I would like to also share the T20 communique and the policy recommendations on 5 aspects that we have been providing. One is fostering recovery and resilience. Second is accelerating the progress towards net zero emissions. The third is governing transformations to the digital society. The fourth is making the economy more inclusive and people-centered. And the last one is reviving global governance. And I think for the theme today, advancing sustainable inclusive infrastructure investment, we have a relevant topic on the second recommendations on accelerating the progress towards net zero emissions. So I think that we can discuss that as well today. Some of the speakers have already discuss and mention about things around that, but we can discuss more. But I think apart from the T20, we may need to also look into the Indonesian context, and then after that to the PLN context, also answering to the questions raised by Henry. For Indonesia, I think it's not unique as a country. As a developing country, we have still a huge amount of financing gap for the infrastructure. The needs for the infrastructure in various sectors are the infrastructures in energy, water, roads and ports, and and some other physical infrastructure as well as social infrastructure are in needs. And of course, the government alone cannot be able to support the financing of all the infrastructures required. That's why the participation of the private is in need. So for that, I think for the last 10 years, government has already pushed so much in the area, not only providing the regulatory framework, but also the institutional framework. Some of the tools have been in place, not to mention the financing, but also the de-risking instruments such as the government guarantees. But again, it's not enough. Still, the challenge is, the lack of the readily bankable projects. So that's, I think, to the point of Manu have already mentioned, and to the point that BNDES have already done in Brazil in the context of the good, proper, well-prepared project preparation is also the key. So, undermining the readily pipeline to be absorbed by the market, bankable projects that is well-prepared is something that actually the government have already known and have already started to develop the similar project development facilities within the PT SMI as well as PT PII, the Indonesia Infrastructure Guarantee Fund. So those infrastructure, the elements of the institutional framework for the participation of public, the private sectors into the public infrastructure space have already been there, but still, I think it's still developing, and I think to the point that what is needed is also not only the commitment from the government agencies, the contract agencies, but also the understanding of various ecosystem, various elements of the stakeholders, the banks, the financiers, investors, as well as the supporting consultants that is working within Indonesia. So I think that's basically the same, issues that we have been facing in various countries around the world. And knowing that, I think we in Indonesia have started to develop various aspects. Now, we are talking about not only the issues of the infrastructure development and how to move forward. At the same time, now we are getting some more perspective into it, which is the ESG, the energy transition. So this aspect is also putting the color into the framework and all the thinking around this in the country. And we have also started to discuss about this. In PLN, for example, we have already developed our net zero carbon roadmap towards 2060, and we realized that various streams needs to be addressed. It's not only on the financing infrastructure framework that we have been developing. I think PLN have done quite a lot of initiatives in this area. I can tell that in terms of the framework, we have been assisted by the multilateral in developing our sustainable financing framework, ESG framework, and even still we have been successful a few years ago in developing, assigning the green financing or ESG related financing for our particular renewable energy projects. So I think we have done a bit, but we still have need to do more in pushing this forward, particularly with regard to at the same time, we need to develop infrastructure, but the infrastructure which is sustainable and also inclusive. That's the challenge. So we need the support from everyone. I think Pak Luki, in the opening speech, has also mentioned that institutional framework have been developed by Indonesian government. There is an Indonesia SDG Indonesia 1 as a platform for blended finance, and recently, 2 months ago, the government have also already set up the country platform for the energy transitions, which is basically focusing on 2 streams. One is early retirement of coal-fired power plants, and the second is really developing the new renewable energy projects. So I think that's probably the context. And again, answering the questions, Indonesia now is in the process of making the energy transitions as well as at the same time meeting the needs of the infrastructure development, which is sustainable and inclusive. So I think that's probably as a start for the discussion. Back to you, Henry.
Thank you, and thank you for highlighting how you currently sort of planning ahead for that transition. How much, project preparation remains very much a gap, and last but not least, highlighting that you can actually create those platforms, such as the one you've created in collaboration with ADB for retirement of coal-fired plants. So there are ways to sort of leverage innovation out there, and many of those aspects are sort of currently covered in the G20 work that we're doing. But thanks for highlighting how important they are to you and eventually to Indonesia when it comes to the access to green sustainable energy. So now we're going to go from national to urban, so more locally, and we're going to hear from Mr. Stephen Daswell from U20. So my question will be sort of focused on urban mobility, and maybe if you could share your experience and also the reflection of the U20 on how can government ensure that limited funds that are available for transport infrastructure are used effectively, and what can be the role of the private sector there?
Oh, thank you. First of all, it's an honor for me to be asked to participate and also to listen to the really perceptive comments of my fellow panelists. Now, I think emerging from the pandemic, more than ever, we need sustainable, equitable, long-term investment in public transport expansion. And I'm sure we all agree that the benefits of investing in public transport are huge, much wider than just basic city mobility, because of the positive impacts on employment hinterland, unlocking homes, national and regional economic growth, the role in tackling the climate crisis and improving health and quality of life outcomes. So for all these reasons, the history of Transport for London dates back to the London Underground system created over 150 years ago. And that's been one of the critical elements in London's growth and the UK's modern economic success. Right now, Transport for London is coming to the end of its first 20-year investment cycle, and that's delivered upgrades on most of the tube lines, new overground rail services, vastly improved bus services, and extended the network to connect even more places, including the Great New Crossrail project. But at the minute, the gains from this investment are at risk because even before the pandemic, the funding constraints imposed on TfL have meant that we've had to start deferring much needed renewal and investment in the assets that we've already got. And patch and mend rather than asset management is clearly not the best way to facilitate the continued operations of what we've got. And what we really want to do is to reset this and ensure that London continues to have the transport it needs and will need in the future to keep the UK economy growing. So I'm really looking at this not just from the point of view of investment in new infrastructure, but also keeping what we've got working as effectively and efficiently as possible. And my main message is that in order for us to be efficient with the funds that we've got, we think a transport operator needs to have, the key thing would be a suitable funding framework. And for me, I see this as having 3 main dimensions. The first one is the quantum of funding, which needs to be correct. It needs to be sufficient to enable maintenance, renewal, as well as expansion to meet future needs. But there is a question of how does that quantum of funding get determined? Secondly, we have the duration of the funding. And I've seen that living from one short-term emergency funding deal to another during the pandemic has just highlighted to me how inefficient it is for planning, for decision-making, and for getting good value for money to have short-term deals. So what's needed is much, much longer certainty over the amount of funding. And that comes together in my third point, which is that the set of outputs that are required, it needs to be stable. Obviously, that has to flex according to emerging challenges, but chopping and changing just because of political volatility doesn't lead to good decision making and good use of money. So just to sum that up, at Transport for London, we've been making the case for long-term funding certainty, which is really what we need to get on and deliver what London and the UK needs. And what that probably looks like is something like a 5-year funding framework. And really, that's only simply matching the long asset life and long timelines for planning and delivery of capital investment, and at the same time matching, for anyone who knows the UK, the sorts of frameworks that the National Rail Body, National Highways Body, and the privatised utility companies have. And I'd be interested to know if that would be relevant for other cities as well. Thank you.
Thanks, and again, a great example of how important the government and agencies such as TfL are in sort of creating that enabling environment for private sector investment. There needs to be sort of long-term planning and also guarantee of funding. Otherwise, things are obviously a lot harder it's a lot harder to sort of get private financing into those projects. So thanks for highlighting that. And again, the important role that the government can play to leverage private sector investment. I'm going to turn to the other person from U20, so all the way now to Barcelona, and to Mr. Alvaro Loscos. So from your experience, and again, leveraging on the work of the G20, from your perspective, how is the opportunity of, is there an opportunity for new and innovative policy when it comes to the sustainable financing of transport system in particular?
Thank you for inviting me.
We can't hear you.
Hello, do you hear me?
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. I was saying thank you for inviting me to this very interesting panel. I do agree with every of the points that have been raised so far. I have a transport planning background, so I do not work exactly with financing, even though I've been working very close to the financing team in actually finding from the public administration what are the funds and what are the sources that we could look for in order to finance all these both on one hand the infrastructure and the other hand the operating cost of the public transport. But first of all, I would like to highlight the importance of what we are working on, because at this point in history, we have very solid information that we are both coming from research and scientists, that we are finishing the era of cheap oil. And that we don't have yet coming any alternative that is viable to the power and scale that we had with oil. And we don't even know if it's physically viable, because when we think of electric or hydrogen or all these options, they are still very not mature. And when they are thought, to the scale of what oil is doing, they are not at the same scale. So deliver a robust public transport system. It's a huge and very important priority for sustainable, equitable, long-term, and in the middle of what we are facing with the energy, climate, and social crisis. And I have to highlight also that this doesn't mean, for the European cities, maybe at some point, and many Asian and many others, but we did that like 150 years ago, and as the colleague of Transport for London was highlighting, by constructing some infrastructures like underground systems that at this point in history are going to be very, very difficult to replicate. So we need to focus on like every public transport facility that we can think of. I mean, we are thinking of bus lanes. It's something that we are working a lot in Barcelona at this moment. We are thinking of tramways. We are thinking even on cables that we've seen develop in cities like La Paz or Medellin that are way more visible to the economies that we are now have, both in developing and developed countries. So that's something that we now share because of the difficulties of you are all like sharing to us today, that it's the financing and the short terms that most of the time the private sector asks for making these efforts of investment. So it is very important to design cities around public transport to reduce the car dependency, and because it's a policy that can contribute up to 40% of the total global emission reduction. So if we are heading to this important target, it's very important to invest and to have a clear policy of developing a good public transport system. And it's very important also in economic terms, because it creates a lot of industry activity, because you have to produce not only the construction of these infrastructures, but also the operating of them, because they are located works position, because everyone that is working for this, for managing these infrastructures, it's the people that live in the same city. It's not a manufacturer that can be externalized to another country. So that's very important. It's very important because public transport is much more efficient and it's something that we should count to also in the use of space in the city. I mean, whenever you develop public transport systems, you have more space available for other activities that are very much necessary. We need more green spaces in our city. And that means that we have to take cars out from cities, and we need to develop more walkable, more bikeable cities, and public transport helps to that, because being more efficient to move people and through the cities and into the cities, that creates more opportunities to have more space. And it's also it's a social policy also when you develop public transport, because it's a fairer mode of transport than it is a car-based system, because you can develop a fair policy that includes, that has criteria like age, like the social, economic situation of every person, and you can develop a special fares for everyone to be able to access the public transport. So this is very important too. I mean, a car, not everyone has a driving license, not everyone has the opportunity to have a driving license, not everyone has the opportunity to buy a car. So public transport, it's for everyone. I mean, no matter how you're young, I mean, until you are 18 years old, you cannot have a driving license in Barcelona, for instance. And that you can be using the public transport from, I mean, the age of 12 years old in your own, and well, and a lot, and also for all people. So overall, an urban mobility system based on transport and public transport, biking and walking would save more than 5 trillion per year globally by the 2050. That's a number that the C40 have come up, and it's a very important to keep it in mind. So here, all the economies present in the G20 have the opportunity of taking all these points into account, and of course develop and take actions and lead by the example. And I will touch a little bit more on what is the framework that we are putting together in Barcelona to make this happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you both for highlighting, I mean, one of the key examples, which is, yes, cities are critical to the economy, they're critical to the climate agenda, and public transport is at the core of that. Unfortunately, public transport, as we know, usually doesn't pay for itself, and that's where you need sort of long-term funding from governments in order to enable the cities and the economy to work. So I think it's probably a call to the G20 member out there to sort of look well after cities, and we're going to have a second session more specifically on subnational, so we'll have the chance to deepen our knowledge on solutions for this. So now we've really sort of covered, I think, from a wide variety of angles, the issues around the financing gap. So let's move towards sort of more sustainability, and I'm going to turn first to Mr. Raju Munusamy from D20. And so one of the key challenges for scaling up sustainable infrastructure investments, especially in developing countries, is the lack, I mean, we've touched on that earlier, but the lack of well-prepared projects that are attractive to investors, especially from, as you say, from a risk perspective. So what can be done to scale up those projects? Yeah, so if you can sort of share your experience, both from the B20 and PwC as well, that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, this is an important prerequisite, right? It's been mentioned many times over the years. And for regular infrastructure projects, several panel members also mentioned this just now. And if you look at it from the sustainable infrastructure project, it's just add up to importance, just enhance further. So I look at it here from 3 angles. The first one is the standardization, right? Government, whether it's a regional or national government, they need to commit on preparing the infrastructure projects with some, in this case, let's take the G20 principles for infrastructure project preparation. This is endorsed already by the G20 leaders in 2018, and also by making use of MDB tools, for example, such as Source, which is an online infrastructure project preparation. It's a form of a software. So that will strengthen the capacity of the project developers to develop the so-called investment-ready infrastructure projects. Now, at PwC Indonesia, for example, we have also been disseminating what is known as the 5-case model, right? And so it's a framework from the UK Infrastructure Project Authority. In fact, as part of our role in B20 as a knowledge partner for the B20 Finance and Infrastructure Task Force, we held a side event in the form of free training. Now, the 5-case models covers 5 different areas you look at when you prepare a project, looking at it from a strategic angle, from economic angle, commercial, financial, as well as from the management. This kind of framework and understanding will improve the ability to better prepare future projects. The second part is often the most challenging part of project planning preparation is in the early stage. So this is where government should create and scale up facilities to develop and finance that early stage of the infrastructure, the project development, so that you take on a part of the risk ahead before you offer it to the infrastructure players. The third one, now this is regarding the currency risk. First of all, in this projects, if the governments can accept foreign exchange risk, just like when you do a sovereign borrowing, this will definitely increase the pool of investors and lenders available to finance the project. This is part of making the project is more attractive, more ready, so-called, right? This currency risk is also a key issue for international institutions who consider when investing in a project where the country does not have a long-term swaps market. So there is no hedging available, and also the need to guarantee to mitigate that currency risk. Now, this is where I think government can improve access to finance. Another thing is by accepting infrastructure project obligations in foreign currency, that the government is willing to pay in foreign currency instead. Thank you.
Thank you for highlighting, I think, 2 critical things when it comes to the preparation of project. The first one, obviously, on early stage preparation, and that's usually sort of a key challenge, going from an idea to a project where you can start engaging with the private sector. And that, there's almost no private sector out there that can really take that on. So that's really the role of governments, especially when we have to integrate carbon neutrality objectives as part of those projects. And the second one, which is probably increasingly being difficult in a very high inflation environment, is obviously the FX risk, and that's where also governments can play a critical role in addressing those risks. So thanks for highlighting those 2. I'm going to now turn to Ms. Frederik Jonsson from the G20 again. And so I think one of TF8's policy areas, developing national strategy and the role of sovereign wealth funds and international investments to support infrastructure projects. So what existing practices could benefit sustainable infrastructure investments?
Okay, so in terms of existing practices, I think I would probably go back to the same issue of preparation, because this is something that we struggle with, especially on the African continent. So one area that we are looking at in terms of scaling is a project called the Quality Infrastructure for Africa project. And this is a collaboration between ASSET out of NEPAD, as well as the OECD, which is doing three key things. One, identifying what those pipelines are, the needs that countries have for financing, whether it's through sovereign wealth funds or other, but really identifying what that bankable pipeline is, building on existing databases to create that pool of bankable projects. Secondly, we will be looking at developing communities of practice where we can bring some of these infrastructure professionals together and build the capacity that we have already seen that is lacking. And then thirdly, looking at existing structures again. We just don't want to repeat or create new things where they're not necessary. So for instance, looking at how the PETA quality label can be used to help countries standardize and prepare themselves to access some of these additional financing with sovereign wealth funds or others. So that's basically the angle that we're looking at, is identifying these key projects and making sure that countries are prepared enough to seek investment, be it through capacity building, through identifying databases of projects, and also scaling existing quality labels like PQL.
Thank you. And it's great that you mentioned committee of practice, because it's definitely something we've been running for a few years now, the African Leadership Fellowship Program in partnership with the private sector and the French government. There's definitely some of the key learning from that program is the strength of practitioners learning and exchanging practices when it comes to those infrastructure projects. That really sort of goes a long way in addressing some of those project preparation issues that you've just mentioned. So thanks for highlighting that. I'm going to stay with the T20 and go back to Ms. Cynthia Wesley. So on practical level, how should the current Indonesia investment climate be improved, enabling environment be improved to accelerate sustainable infrastructure financing? You already mentioned the ADB sort of collaboration on sort of phasing out coal plants. Is there any others, or maybe you want to sort of explain a little bit more about that platform?
Yeah, I think the optimism is there. We are developing the infrastructure framework in Indonesia, and also increasing the understanding of where to go and why should we all do that. So I think the rationale and the intention is clear from the government perspective, and for PLN probably as the key players in this infrastructure space. So I think that's the situation currently in Indonesia. And specifically for sustainable infrastructure investment, what we may need to do is, currently we are focusing for the energy sector, for example, we are focusing on how to increase the share of the renewable energy for the power production, for example. At the moment, Indonesia power production source about 60% from coal, and we need to have a concrete plan on how to reduce this from time to time. And at the same time, we are also need to develop the renewable energy power plants along the way. So I think with that, first the understanding of the needs of the sustainable infrastructure investment in the country is already there by the government, by PLN as a key players, and I suppose also the understanding by the key stakeholders in terms of the private sectors, banks, lenders, project developers, as well as investors. But then what do we need to do? I think along the line with all the speakers have mentioned before, that I would like to share, I think at least 7 C's that we need to think about this. One is really clarity, and second is certainty. The third is consistency, and we're also talking about credibility, creditworthiness, capacity, and also continuity of the pipeline. And along all of the 7 C's, I think we have seen the development in Indonesia in terms of the framework, regulatory framework improvement, institutional framework improvement, as well as the program for capability building for the contracting agencies, for example. So it's true that the capacity needs to be enhanced for the government contracting agencies, including PLN also, because we have so many challenges at the same time. And specific for PLN, I think with regard to the power purchase agreement, which has been there for more than 3 decades, and we can say that the power purchase agreement in PLN is already bankable enough. So I don't think we have an issue with that, but we still have a challenge in how to develop more renewable energy projects as well as the way to have the right and proper energy transition mechanism in the country. And also we have a point where the role of the multilateral is very important. The multilateral has at least have a role as enhancer of the credibility of the projects, because they need to look into how the project is well structured, the fair risk allocation is there, and the good documentations of the project, the proper risk allocations and bankable documents, concession agreements, but also as a credit enhancer. Mano have mentioned about the first early stage risk of the project that needs to be also enhanced, and the idea of how the risk to be mitigated, particularly with regards to the one is really the construction risk, the how to get this project can be constructed, land risk, everything around the project development, as well as the political risk. So I think the risk mitigation for that and risk instruments and risk mitigants needs to be there. And I think Indonesia have already set up few steps around this, and I think many other countries can also look into what we have been doing. Still, of course, it's still being developed to enhance here and there. So I think those aspects that needs to be addressed, once we are able to address that well, then I believe that the scaling up of the infrastructure development in Indonesia would be there. Again, so in summary, that of course, the well-structured and well-defined bankable projects ready for investment is really the key. Infrastructure, investment infrastructure framework, the institutional framework, the regulatory framework, as well as the understanding of all the key stakeholders doing the infrastructure projects in Indonesia. Back to you, Henry.
Thank you, and thank you for reminding us of all the great success in the past with all the PPAs in Indonesia when it comes to the energy sectors. It's definitely something to learn from there, including the 7 Cs. So talking about the required innovation, especially when it comes to sustainable infrastructure and renewables, maybe I'm going to turn to U20 and Mr. Alvaro Loscos. What schemes, policies at the urban level, but maybe we can learn from there at the sort of national level, or initiatives from Barcelona can be applied to other cities and other governments to attract sustainable infrastructure financing?
Thank you for the question. Okay, I'm going to be explaining a little bit how the case of Barcelona works, but I think that it's that it can be replicable elsewhere. The first thing is that when you have to pay back for all these infrastructures and operating costs, I mean the two the two only sources of funding that you're having, it's mainly in the case of Barcelona, the public administration budgets and the user fares. We are talking here about the public transport systems. And of course, at some point for both financing and even and for financing mostly the infrastructure, it is needed the private sector, but it is mostly is used as a resource of money. I mean, it is used as a bank because I mean all the pay how we are going to return this money comes always from these two sources that I'm mentioning. So the things that are key and important, it's a regulatory framework that it's solid and that it has a clear instruments in which how you are going to finance these mobility infrastructure and transport infrastructures. And this would go to look for two basic things. I mean, the construction of transport infrastructure creates a value, and you need to capture this value in order to be able to afterwards finance both the maintenance and the extension of these infrastructures. And the other thing that you're going to target, it's the externalities that you don't want to happen. I mean, at this point, I mean, you have I was mentioning before the inequality and the use of space and all the emissions that the transport sector, the combustion one, the one that is using oil, the car system. I mean, all those externalities that it's having in cities, we need to find them and put a value on them, and it's going to help also in the transition to a more sustainable system. The other thing that we need, and for that you need a regulatory framework. The other thing that is very important are the authorities, the regional authorities or regional institutions that coordinate at a investment or at a funding level all the transport infrastructure that are doing that in servicing an urban area. So that the organizing around urban areas, it's very, very important, because that way you would have the state level, the regional level, and the metropolitan level, the city level, all in the same institution present. And for instance, in the case of Barcelona, the infrastructures are paid 50% by the regional government, and the other 50% are paid between the metropolitan authority and the cities itself of the city of Barcelona. So that is also a very important. And this organization, this authority, also works as a planning planning authority. So that's where you coordinate the investment that has to happen in transport infrastructure for all these different administrations and prioritize them. So what is going to happen next? I mean, what is going to be more important? I mean, we are going to be investing in dedicated bus lanes, in tramways, in railways, in whatever. So that is decided in that way, and that is financed from the same authority and coordinated from there for a city and its metropolitan area. So that is very important. And the other thing that it's the main function of these authorities is to decide the first system. So what are we going to ask? I mean, for the users of this transport system to actually use this transport system, because it's one of the main sources of funding the operating cost of the transport network, and it has to be very important that it's socially. I mean, that it reduces inequality. I mean, you have to focus on who can pay more, who can pay less, and at the time, I mean, and what use are you doing of the public transport in order to decide what are going to be the first system that you are going to apply. So that would be like three, like the regulatory framework, the regional authority, and the things that I think that are important in order to actually at the end, I mean, show that you are a solid and a robust institution and administration, and to ask in this pool of financing, in which the public sector also, by the user first, and also by the budgets of the administration, and also participating in this pool of financing, it's where the private would feel also comfortable to put and to gather, well, or to join in and put also some financing in to come to actually be able to develop all these infrastructures. But I mean, all the other things are necessary and are key and important.
Thank you. So regulatory framework, regional coordination, and making sure that on the operation funding side that the cost to the users is still socially acceptable. I think those are the key challenges usually for public transport development, which again are critical in achieving the economic and sort of climate goals overall. So staying with cities, I'm turn now to Mr. Daswell. So what scheme policies, again, same question, an initiative from London can be applied to other cities, and what can we learn from your experience when it comes to financing?
Yeah, so my perspective in London is really that of one from a developed country. And the UK has a strong credit rating, and therefore usually TfL's experience is that access to capital at a reasonable cost is not a problem. I know that's not the same, obviously, for all cities, but in London, we've actually developed a number of ways of sourcing finance for our investments. So I'll recap on 3 of those. The cheapest cost of capital has been for TfL to borrow directly. We have a balance sheet with £14 billion from a variety of sources, including bonds and multilateral loans, as well as public finance. We've invested that money into the network. Secondly, we've mixed that up with several privately financed infrastructure projects, such as the Silvertown Tunnel PPP that I recently closed. And we've also leased several fleets of trains from the private sector. And thirdly, we leverage as much as possible the balance sheets of our suppliers. So one example would be all of our bus operators who actually have the buses on their balance sheets at the cost in aggregate of sort of several £billion. What we want to do going forward really is to continue to use those sorts of financing mechanisms. Just to step back, in London, we have a mayor's transport strategy that sets out a long-term vision of the projects that we would carry out. These are sorts of things from investing in zero emissions buses to expanding the network in terms of coverage and capacity and accessibility. However, at the minute, our current circumstances is that quite a lot of that plan can't currently be delivered. And the main constraint on us investing is not the availability of capital for direct or indirect borrowing. It's the affordability of the repayment of that finance within our currently challenging funding envelope. And the reason is that we're required to manage our borrowing, all of our borrowing, in a prudent way. So only if we can afford to repay borrowing in future from our revenues should we be doing that. And therefore, really to allow us to increase the amount of investment that we undertake, we're actually going to have to see our long-term funding envelope set in a way where it's enlarged either by grant or demand recovery or new sources of income. And only then can we really avail ourselves of the fantastic opportunities to use either private finance or public borrowing. Just to touch on a couple of current things that we are doing within the current funding envelope constraints, I'll just briefly mention. One is that the Mayor of London has announced that he plans to issue a 500 million sterling green bond to finance carbon reduction measures such as efficient heating and installing electric vehicle charging points. And this is great because it's self-funding and allows the finance to be repaid from the savings. And also self-funding is the development of a target of 20,000 more homes across London, which we're achieving by combining the value of our land assets with the skills and finance of selected property partners. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks. And I mean, the point that you make about sort of, the easy access, I mean, relatively easy access to capital is something that even in emerging country can be addressed. There's a lot of examples of MDBs managing to get, transport assets, for example, sort of getting better sort of credit ratings sometimes than even the national government if set up right. So I think there are innovations out there that enable to unlock that capital. But to your point, just access to that capital doesn't mean necessarily that deals are and projects are easy. You still need to look at the sustainability of the investment going forward. I'm going to turn now to the last questions before I think we may have maybe one question from the audience at the end, back to BNDES. And can you share and elaborate maybe on some of the best practices that you have been implementing in an emerging country environment?
Well, as I said, our approach involves enhanced project preparation, providing quality projects via robust studies, adequate risk allocation, ensuring a transparent bidding process, and also including sustainability assessments and requirements in the structuring. So in order to reach that, this quality and scale that we are aiming, our projects factory had to build a strong team, project management systems, process, and standardization. An important element of this process is stakeholders management, not only on the client side, but also we need to manage our public clients, various government levels. We have an important role in advocacy and articulation within this group of stakeholders. But also we need to play an important role on investor relations, on attracting investors. We engage very early in the process with investors through market soundings, road shows. We aim at providing transparent and equitable information for them to be prepared for the bidding process. We need to want to attract as much competition as possible. And we have the challenge also we need to make a large effort to bring new investors to new markets we are opening. We are opening new markets. Sanitation, before the new law was enacted in 2020, 2 years ago, already had some concessions, but not at the scale we are seeing now. So that requires new investors, that requires more capital. We were very successful actually to do that in the sanitation sector. We brought investors from different sectors, from the energy sector, for example, electricity. We brought the Canadians, they invested, they already were, Brookfield was already in Brazil, but we brought the Canadian funds and companies from Spain, for example, to invest. So I mean, it's a lot of effort that is required on investor relations. And to support that, we have created the BNDES Projects Hub. We have a slide on that. I wanted to navigate, but it would be a bit complicated. So I have a slide with the address and the homepage. I'm not sure if we can share this now. It's slide 5 of my slide deck. And the hub was launched 2 years ago. It's a platform that we created with up-to-date information on projects, again, to allow them to prepare for the bids. And we have also introduced an innovative tool, it's a social network called Investors Network, to connect investors and other players on a neutral way. Through this platform, through the hub, the investors can simply navigate in the sectors and projects and click a project, get the information, see the timeline, assess the bidding documents when they are ready. They can also see sector information, and they can go into this network. They need to, of course, make a registration, define a profile, their preferences, and they connect. They can connect, send messages, and establish a first contact on a neutral way. So After, and this is 2 years ago, and the hub is working. It's pretty active. We have a good level of access at this stage. But last year we started to search new ways to expand. And the previous slide, I believe. Yes, this is the one about our hub. And I would like to invite you to please navigate the address. There's a QR code and the address for you to reach the platform. Mid last year, we started to think of new ways to expand the reach of our platform. We actually have connected to GI Hub. We have our link there. But we also started discussing with other developmental agencies whether we could partner. We talked to Banobras and IDB, and we decided to join efforts to create a regional platform, to join efforts with other Latin American countries to attract investment to the region. It works as a marketplace where each country hub supplies its projects to this consolidated hub, which we call LATAM Projects Hub. It's in the next slide. And we connect the projects, provide minimal information. The principles are of transparency and up-to-date information. We have, again, a list of projects where we can navigate, make filters, and click, see the information on that project, see the timeline, the status, CapEx, and then click again and go into the country platform directly. And the reason why you could do that is because we could leverage on the experience of Mexico and Brazil, which already had well-established hubs. And the other important aspect here is that by joining efforts in this marketplace, we can attract a broader investors base. And investors look at regions on a portfolio approach. So that's how we want to expand the reach through this new platform. And we are planning to bring other countries soon with IDB support. We also have ALIDE as an important partner here. ALIDE is the Latin America Association of Development Banks. And we are planning to expand soon. There is another aspect of this platform. It indicates whether the project has sustainability-related information. So currently, if we could go to the next slide, please. I think the next slide is just an overview of the platform with the website. Again, I encourage you to navigate. And the following, it's just, I think the next slide is just how the projects are presented in the list. And then again, you can filter, you can click, you can see them in the map. And for example, here, we got here an example of Mexico, a Mexican project. And the reason why I'm getting it is because you can see the flag of sustainability information. When you see that, it's because you can click in the projects hub, in this case, in Mexican projects hub, and see how they disclose information on sustainability. Mexican Projects Hub has adopted IDB classification methodology, which BNDES is currently studying together with the Ministry of Economy of Brazil. And we are actually planning to pilot it. We already done a pilot on existing projects that were structured in the past. And now we are starting to pilot in the structuring process with two objectives. One is to prepare projects to provide transparency the same way the Mexican Projects Hub does on the adherence of sustainability dimensions, but also, and perhaps more important, is to assess the level of adherence and propose improvements in the structuring phase. That's what we are trying to do now. We elected 3 projects to run this. So I think it's also worth mentioning that, so this is what I wanted to say about these platforms, and I encourage you to navigate and see how it works. I think I just wanted to also add that BNDES already has in place some tools to assess social and environmental risks. We also have sustainability requirements and elements on the studies associated with social, environmental, climate change dimensions. But by measuring it with the classification proposed by IDB, we expect to be able to further enhance the sustainability in our projects. So that's what I wanted to mention. Back to you, Harry.
Thank you, and it's a great example of, the power of sort of data and collaborative platforms, something that the G20 framework has sort of looked at. There's huge potential there, and obviously BNDES and Mexico and other countries in Latin America have been very successful in leveraging private investment. So thanks so much for highlighting this, and to your point, this is, at the GIAB we have a directory of pipelines, and that's definitely one of the, I think, the best organized one out there, but very keen to continue to work with countries to highlight other platforms that are emerging. So I think that concludes the first session, and I wanted to thank again all panelists for the great insights. Maybe we can offer a round of applause to the panelists. Thank you. Great, and I think on the way, very keen. I think that these sessions have demonstrated how powerful the collaboration between the different 20 groups can bring. So very much looking forward to do more of those collaboration and exchange of insights going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much to our panelists for the fruitful discussion and to Mr. Henry Blas for moderating the first session. Once again, please give big round of applause for our discussion today. Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, before we start the next panel, we will take a break for 8 minutes. Once again, 8 minutes, we will take a break. And we kindly invite all of you to enjoy the refreshment that's served in front of this room. And we'll see you again at 14:45 because of after this seminar, all delegates have to attend the next agenda. We do hope all participants come back to this room precisely at 14:45. Thank you very much. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we will shortly continue our seminar. Please kindly return to your seat. Thank you. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, all participant delegates, please kindly return to your seat to this room. You can take your refreshment into this room so we can start our seminar right away. Thank you very much. Okay, once again, to all participants, all delegates, ladies and gentlemen, we will shortly continue our seminar, so please kindly return to your seat to this room. And we have to continue our seminar to the second panel discussion. And also, all participants may take or bring the refreshment to this room. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, to all participants, all delegates, we will shortly continue our seminar, so please kindly return to your seat again. Thank you very much. Baik Bapak Ibu, para peserta, kita akan memulai rangkaian acaranya. Kami mohon untuk dapat memasuki ruangan ini. Terima kasih. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Advancing Sustainable and Inclusive Infrastructure Investment, a collaborative seminar between the Indonesian G20 Presidency and G20 Engagement Groups, Business 20, Think 20, and Urban 20. We hope you enjoy the coffee break and be ready to join the second session of this seminar. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen.
Si lo puedes devolver una vez que lo tienes, ¿por qué no lo vas a cancelar antes de que te lo envíen?
Okay. We also invite the participant who join virtually from WebEx. You may also give a question at the discussion session to the speaker through the chat room. Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, in the session we will discuss about leveraging private capital to enhance social inclusion through subnational infrastructure. Before we start, let me introduce the moderator, Mr. Nicola Pina. Mr. Nicola Pina is Deputy Director of the Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs to the OECD. He leads the infrastructure work across DAF and is responsible for the policy areas of anti-corruption, consumer finance, insurance, and pensions. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Nicola Pina.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be opening and moderating this second session of the seminar on advancing sustainable and inclusive infrastructure investment, which is a collaborative seminar between the Indonesian G20 presidency and G20 engagement groups. So as you are all aware, the responsibility for public investment in infrastructure is not only the responsibility of central government, it's also and very much the responsibility of local subnational authorities. And there, in a way, there is some sort of paradox, because in our multilateral discussions, we put a lot of emphasis on infrastructure investment at the national level. And the share of the discussion that we are dedicating to investment in infrastructure at the local level remains relatively limited. It's a paradox because when we look at the figures, in fact, and we have with the OECD, with United Cities and local governments, we have produced numbers and data on public investment by subnational governments. And we show that actually 60% of public investment is actually undertaken, carried out by subnational governments. So this means that those governments, they have an important role to play to help deliver high-quality infrastructure investment that facilitate, in particular, inclusivity and sustainability. And some of the issues have been really raised and discussed during the first session, including at their applicability at the subnational level. They invest, of course, in social infrastructure, education, health, but also beyond that in transport, water, sewage, and energy infrastructure. But despite this central role, we know that subnational governments, they face specific challenges when it comes to investing in infrastructure, raising also capital to invest in infrastructure for different reasons. The first one is that they are not always credit-worthy, and they have therefore difficulties to go to capital markets and to raise finance for infrastructure investment. And again, when you look at the data, it's interesting to see that actually only a bit more than 20% of subnational government debt is actually in the form of bonds issuance. It's obviously much higher when it comes to central governments. If you take OECD countries and less economies, it's the integral public debt that is in the form of bond issuance. So the question is, what is required to improve access of subnational governments to finance? And there we will look at several policy agenda. Obviously, the one of the G20, and it's really a great thing that this year Indonesia has prioritized this issue of infrastructure investment at the subnational level. With the OECD, we are contributing actively at this, to this conversation this year. We will be delivering tomorrow, in fact, a policy toolkit on mobilizing funding and financing for inclusive and quality infrastructure at the subnational level. And we are looking at different aspects, the enabling environment for infrastructure investment at the subnational level, and the different financing instruments and funding instruments that are available to that end. I'm glad to have the B20 on board. Obviously, they play a critical role. In the previous session, we've seen how important the role of the private sector can be or should be in investing in infrastructure. This is also applicable at the subnational level, but perhaps the difficulties of mobilizing the private sector for infrastructure investment at the local level is even more difficult, even higher than at the central government level. We will have, of course, the agenda of the T20, which is looking at inclusive cities through resilient and adaptive infrastructure finance, notably for urban informalities. T20 is also looking at governance issues as well, notably the collaboration, which was mentioned by the colleague from Barcelona, the collaboration across different levels of government, and also the issue of project preparation, planning, and so on. And of course, the U20, which is discussing how cities can ensure that economic growth is equally distributed, is beneficial to all communities, and to ensure equal access to sustainable mobility. So I'd like to now invite the speakers to the stage. So first of all, Miss Christina Garbin. I don't think I need to introduce Christina. She's the co-chair of the Infrastructure Working Group. She's Assistant Secretary, Global and Multilateral Branch at the Australian Treasury. So please, Christina, join me on the floor. I will feel a bit less lonely. We will have from the T20 online, normally, Ms. Joissa Dutra, who is a director at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas. And she's a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on the Future of Energy. So, Joissa, good morning, Brazil, I guess.
It's quite early here.
Thank you early, yes,
for
I know.
inviting
so
me.
Thanks for being here. For the B20, I will invite Mr. Arif Budiman, who is a deputy chair of the Finance and Infrastructure Task Force of the B20, Deputy CEO of the Indonesian National Investment Authority. Welcome, Arif. I would like also to invite Julian Smith, who is a Knowledge Partner Lead, also Finance and Infrastructure Task Force of the B20, and who is Infrastructure Leader at PwC Indonesia. And finally, last but not least, Mr. Engar Ferry Sugiarto for the U20. Engar is a Senior Advisor for International Cooperation, Jakarta Capital City Government. Welcome, Engar. So I'd like to, I've talked too much already, so I will now put you to work, so to speak. I'd like to start this conversation with a rapid fire round. So only 1 minute per person, so it's pretty challenging. I'd like you to give the audience actually two components that you think are urgent really to support the use of private capital by subnational governments, but also to enable social inclusion at the same time. So the challenge is really to bring those two dimensions together. So two elements just to, let's say, kick off the conversation, set the backdrop, and break the ice. So please, Christina, you first.
Thank you, Nicolas. Hi, everyone, and thank you to the presidency for hosting this event and for inviting Australia to be on the panel as well. Very quickly, 1 minute, two things. If I can start with is a good pipeline of projects. So I know that has been a big discussion in the last panel session as well. So that's the first one. I think it provides investment-ready projects. It provides transparency and visibility for private sector so they can see what's coming up, including development and projects that are still in early stages, as well as delivery, the ones that are ready for investment in delivery. Second part of my answer for this is around the social inclusion. I think I've always seen that infrastructure is an enabler, so that is one stream of it. So I think we really need to utilize it to provide access, particularly for remote regional areas, to services, education, health, work, employment. So I think well planned and well, obviously with economic returns, but well planned in terms of having social inclusion and being an enabler, having that in mind for project planning is really important. And the second part of that is also the inclusion as a part of the delivery process. So as we're procuring these projects to have procurement targets in place.
Thank you, Christina, for this rapid answer indeed. Joysa, please.
30 seconds. So 2 components, better crafting of quality infrastructure requirements and implementation. Second one, sound improved governance that is endowed with increased coordination, inter and intragovernmental, cross-sectoral, and also between public and private sectors. I will talk about these components over the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Joysa. Now, Engel, please.
Well, thank you for inviting Urban 20 to this panel. So I would like to explain that in August this year, Urban 20 leaders gathered in Jakarta for Urban 20 Mayor Summit and come up with a communique called on the G20 leaders to prioritize investments that increase the share of urban journeys made by public transport, walking and cycling, and also to reduce private car use to improve public health and reduce GHG emissions and inequalities. So investment is needed to ensure a just transition to zero emission transport, public and private, to accelerate energy transitions. And public transport is in urban areas must be safe, clean, reliable, inclusive, and affordable. So the components needed by the national sub-governments are regulatory supports and incentive, and also capacity building to develop backable project proposal. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you, Engel. Please, Arif.
Thank you. So I think we all have come with the same answer, 2 answers. B20, we are representing the business community, which we are really passionate to actually participate in the infrastructure development. And one of the key hurdles is really the availability of a well-prepared investment-ready projects. So just to echo what the other panelists is saying, really to have that pipeline is extremely important. Number 2, as you highlighted, subnational government indeed tend to have lower creditworthiness. So possibilities around how to enhance that, for example, in the form of national, in addition to capacity building, is underwriting, for example, a national government guarantee to some of those regional or subnational projects would greatly enhance the viability of some of those infrastructure opportunities for the business community. So those are the 2.
Thank you, Arif. Julian, please.
Thank you, Nicola. Christina mentioned social inclusion, but Arif mentioned project preparation. Putting those 2 together, one of the most important things is that gender and social inclusion is considered right at the beginning of the project preparation phase. It can't just be an afterthought. And as part of that is considering the international frameworks for these matters, such as the Equator Principles, the IFC performance standards on environmental and social risks. Because too often we find that a local government wants to raise finance, wants to attract investors, and these things haven't been thought of, and you can't go back and retrofit them.
Thank you, very interesting, but obviously all the keywords are there, project preparation, social inclusion, governance, capacity building. We could also certainly add the institutional framework and collaboration across levels of government. That's a good basis to set the backdrop. So now I'd like you to elaborate. So Christina, maybe to start with, as I said at the start, we are delivering to the G20 this policy toolkit on mobilizing funding and financing for quality infrastructure investment at the subnational level. How do you see this toolkit being used, being integrated in cities and regions? Also bearing in mind really the different situation, the different circumstances in which those cities and regions are operating, and also their different characteristics.
Thank you, Nicolas. For us, and I will bring in some examples from back home, from Australia as well, as I answer this particular question. Just to start with, maybe the key, outlining the 4 pillars that are in the policy toolkit, as you well know, which we've already heard actually in the rapid fire round, is about the enabling environment, which goes to well-planned pipeline, having a long-term vision, and creating the environment. And then the other 2 are around funding instruments and financing instruments. And then the last one is around investment approaches. So I just wanted to form my answer into 3 key areas. One around the planning, preparation, and then second one around looking for opportunities, and then the last one around the delivery. So sweeping back to the investment ready and having a pipeline, I think it is critical. It ticks a lot of boxes, particularly in terms of the private sector and engagement and having visibility. We've had a lot of feedback that not having visibility or what the governments have committed, what their pipeline. So, for example, in Australia, we have a 10-year infrastructure investment pipeline that is a rolling 10-year pipeline, so it's not a one-off pipeline. So every budget one year goes off and another year comes on, and it has where the governments have committed to business cases, early business cases, planning and development phases, and then also where the big money is in the delivery side, the delivery component. So there's full visibility. That's at the federal level, but that also enables the state and local governments and the private sector to be able to look at that and look at where the investments are going in and work in partnership. Having good frameworks and regulations in place around that investment pipeline is really important. And then and in regional areas for us, and in particular, that capability building, which I'll come to a bit more, and having that visibility for regions, if they know a rolling program, that they know that they can have skilling up of capability in the communities and really remote communities, it's really important for us as well. Secondly, on the opportunities, I think we've heard about the local, particularly local and state governments, or the subnational governments having much lower credit ratings. So we do need to look into innovative financing opportunities. One of the things I did want to say is about partnering, partnering across government. Across regions as well is really important. I know we talked about partnering at different levels of government, but what we're finding is actually a really small local government, on its own, it may not have the same impact as if there was a more of a regional approach, a collective coalition approach, so that attract more of an investment as well. A quick example, we had a lot of development for Northern Australia strategy and a really push to look at investment and funding in Northern Australia. So where we are looking at partnering with new industries, but also partnering across portfolio with housing and health and education portfolios, where infrastructure is the theme, but not just looking at transport on its own, for example, looking at comms. And when you're looking at opportunities, I think it's great to look across portfolio as well. And then lastly, obviously, the financing side of it. I focus a lot on regional areas, but also for the urban areas, I think it's really important to look at all the different types. And we've had a few big successes with partnering with local government on public transport projects using value capture and asset recycling, lots of different ways, but it all is dependent on the specific location and the circumstances of that particular area as well. And lastly, around the delivery and procurement frameworks and putting through some streamlined or frameworks around it, but again, it needs to be fit for purpose for the particular region or a state. At the federal level, there's very large kind of policies and frameworks that are fit for the national level policies, but then each of the state and local governments should have their own procurement policies. But then there's also some customized ones, and I'll give another example. We had a package up in very northern end of Australia, in the Cape York. So we've had a couple of rolling packages of infrastructure there, where there are a lot of Indigenous communities, and obviously the need for infrastructure was very key because of the seasonal nature of and access issues for roads. So we had developed a package where it was all levels of government funding, a large amount of funded by the federal government, and worked through the state government, but also working with local communities and the Indigenous community as well, to look through a few things. From the beginning, we looked at priorities, identified priorities collectively, then went through the procurement process collectively, where we put in some targets, whether they're about employment targets, whether they're local industry participation, or whether it's business targets, and then put a governance structure around it specifically for this, where we had key people sitting on it to monitor it and report back. And as it went on, in terms of skilling up and making sure people are skilled up and being able to stay in their communities as well. So something like that. It may not work for everywhere, but it worked in that particular instance, in that particular area. So I think the delivery and making sure we focus on that kind of areas are really, really important. But I'll stop there, Nicola.
Thank you, Christina. And you've probably seen that Australia is actually one of the case studies in the policy toolkit, precisely because of this very fluid way of cooperating across different levels of government. So a very robust institutional framework, and also some innovative financing instruments that you mentioned, such as asset recycling, which at the time was very innovative indeed, and I'm sure that everybody is emulating now. I'd like to turn to Joisa now. How can we support efficient, sustainable, and inclusive infrastructure investment by regional and local governments? I know that it's a very generic question, but it would give you a lot of room to elaborate. Please, Joisa.
So thank you. Firstly, extending a bit on one of the two components I presented in the first segment of the session, I think it's key that we have better crafting of quality infrastructure requirements and implementation, but that rely on clear policy frameworks and programs that move beyond the silos approach, that acknowledge the increasing interconnection and interdependence across sectors and networks, meaning transport, energy, water, for example. It should also be inclusive and support vulnerable people and communities. The equity dimension is critical to sustainable investment in financing in quality infrastructure, so adequately funded, well-maintained, and optimally managed, that meets SDG goals. But the fairness dimension has been overlooked, and not only in emerging and developing economies, but also in developed ones. For instance, weather extremes such as flood events in the US made quite clear that low-income groups have been more exposed to infrastructure failures, a theme that is at the center of the recently approved government's infrastructure package. And finally, it's important that it's conducive to a low-carbon energy transition. We are facing challenging times that often may lead some to doubt our ability to achieve climate goals on time. However, such events make the need to increase sustainable finance for clean energy projects evident. At the local level, there is an enormous potential to invest in clean energy systems that deploy energy efficiency and scale decentralized renewable generation of electricity that allows for digitizing infrastructure, increase efficiency in water use and sanitation, and experiment with an advanced electrification of mobility. Such investments are attractive to private capital, even in emerging and developing economies that struggle with higher costs of capital.
Thank you, Joysa. You said there are tremendous opportunities at the local level to invest in low carbon infrastructure. But the challenge then, and it's a segue to a question to Arif, is how we manage to make the most of those opportunities, and precisely by bringing on board the private sector. So Arif, what is we touched upon that during the first session, obviously, but when it comes to the subnational government level, what is the enabling environment for investment by the private sector in infrastructure?
Thank you. To be open, in B20, we have not yet discussed explicitly about between national and subnational, but I believe that the need that we have identified at the national level, if anything, is actually even more needed at subnational level. So on the B20, we are talking about commercial capital and participation of commercial capital into infrastructure projects. So I think first and foremost, this capital, given the nature of infrastructure that is actually long dated, the first and foremost is obviously stability of the economy or the subnational region in and of itself. And stability, obviously, there is political, economic, and so on and so forth. But if we go into the micro level, when we actually try to evaluate projects in a certain region, the existence of a strong legal framework, contractual framework, in the private side, to put it simply, we look into risk return. How does those risk and return being allocated to the different stakeholders within a certain infrastructure? And how do we make sure that that get translated into a contractual framework and ensuring that those contracts can be implemented? So I think that is the first and foremost at the environment level. And only then we look into the individual projects or availability or pipeline. Now, on this aspect, clearly, I think as mentioned earlier, not only the pipeline itself, but the procurement process needs to be at a certain standard, right? You can call it G20 standards or international standards. Indeed, even in Australia, one of the role model of our countries, there are always differences, but to the extent that some of those framework can be similar so that the investors can look at it, because many of these are global capital. So the more in line the procurement process, standard documentation, the preparation that is needed into international standards, the easier for the investment committees and evaluation of these institutions, be it private, be it pension fund, sovereign wealth fund, whatever, to be able to decide and to compare and to make sure that they actually deploy their capital in a standardized way. So I think environment, how do you execute? We talked earlier about project preparation and so on and so forth. On the inclusion aspect itself, I think it is good to see that the adoption of ESG principles, I think right now, almost everyone, all institutions in the world is adapting that. And by virtue of incorporating that into earlier project preparation, hopefully that actually shorten the time to actually evaluate and make decisions on some of those projects. But these are some of the basic fundamentals. Everyone knows it, kind of, at the macro level or at the very high level, 50,000 feet level. But at least in our B20 dialogues, there seems to be still too limited. Some of these practices needs to be just further enhanced and strengthened at the national level, but even more so at the subnational level.
Thank you, Arif. I like very much the way you frame your answer. I think we need to look at the macro, the meso, and the micro level. And there, when it comes to infrastructure project, maybe we need a real certification mechanism for infrastructure. Perhaps that's something that the IWG may want to discuss one day. Moving to Julian now, and perhaps zooming in further, what can be the different financing structure and instruments to finance infrastructure projects at the subnational level?
So first of all, thank you for the question. First of all, I'd just like to say, even though I'm coming from the B20, in my early career at PwC, I was also an elected municipal councillor for 4 years in northwest London. So I've seen both sides of the story. And in that role, we did one of the UK's first street lighting PPPs and one of the first social housing PPPs. And I've no doubt that our municipal council could never have delivered those infrastructure programs without private finance and the ingenuity of the private sector. Moving specifically to your question, one of the key priorities of our task force has been to advocate and promote the scaling up of the use of blended finance. And I think this is particularly relevant for local government, subnational government, where often the returns from projects are less attractive and maybe the risks are higher. So I'd just like to dwell a moment on what do we actually mean by blended finance, because I've heard these words mentioned a lot during this G20 cycle. And I think it's important to understand it's not about the project, it's about the structuring of the finance. And what blended finance aims to do is bring about a marriage between commercial capital and concessional capital. And each of them helps to leverage the other. In the case where, as I said earlier, you want to bring in the ingenuity and the capital from the private sector, but the returns are not high enough to attract them, then you can marry that with philanthropic or concessional capital from multilaterals or government. And so there are three characteristics of blended finance transactions. First is leverage, as I've just mentioned. You can either, I think what the multilaterals and governments and philanthropists have to do is sometimes it's only a small amount of capital that they need to put in at a concessional rate that can close the gap between the project returns and the reasonable returns that the private sector wants to make a project happen. Second is impact. The private sector is, even nowadays, still primarily motivated by the financial return, although we see much more attention being paid to ESG factors. But what this does is enables the local government to harness that private capital in order to have social impact, whether it's in housing or sewage or whatever. I'm pleased you mentioned the word sewage at the beginning of this introduction, because we have to get into the dirty details of all the projects. And then the third factor is return, because the project should still make a positive return overall, and even the concessional capital, even concessional investors probably want to make some sort of return unless they're just giving a grant, but it enables the project to match the returns of the private sector. I talk about capital. I think there are other ways to do it, grants and guarantees. I think much more use could be made of guarantees. Pat Arif mentioned the creditworthiness of local governments. There are a lot of very good projects in local government, because the local government doesn't have a track record, investors are scared to invest. And so it's actually very good value for a larger national or multinational organization to guarantee the creditworthiness. Because normally local governments don't go bust. The money doesn't disappear, but the investors need a bit of help. Just a last moment. So one thing I must say, of course, is as part of PwC's contribution to the B20, we're running a training course on blended finance, a one-day course on 29th of September, in conjunction with Convergence, which is the global Center of Excellence for blended finance. So I hope some of you might like to join. The last point, I think, one of your points, Nicola, was about whether structures vary between economic and social infrastructure. When I started my career in the UK, there were two different categories. Economic infrastructure is things like transport and utilities, where the consumer pays a commercial rate for the service. And then the social infrastructure is things like housing and education, which might be free at the point of use. I think nowadays, and especially in emerging economies, there's not so much difference. And especially when we talk about green infrastructure, where the part of the outcome is related to reduction of carbon emissions. So I don't see any fundamental difference in the type of structures between economic and social infrastructure. So I hope that's a useful contribution, and hope to see some of you at our training course.
It is a very useful contribution, Julian. I would have time. I'd like to challenge you a bit on blended finance, because there is a lot of talk on blended finance, about blended finance, and it often appears as the magic bullet to precisely ensure the commercial viability of project. But when you look at the figures for uptake of blended finance, it's less convincing, I would say.
Unfortunately, I only had 5 minutes, but my second point would have been that a lot more needs to be done, especially by multilaterals on scaling it up and really leveraging in the private sector. Sometimes the blending is just concessional capital leveraging in more concessional capital, and it really needs to be done in a bigger way. I agree with you. Thank you.
Okay. So to be further discussed, and I'm sure a strong message from the B20 to the G20 would be useful in that respect. And we have Christina there. Edgar, please. It would be really interesting to hear from you on the success story in Jakarta when it comes to investing in inclusive infrastructure. So please, Edgar.
Oh, well, thank you. So public transport is actually key for social inclusion, as it connects people, our beloved ones, and then connecting our families, communities, jobs, and our cities. So Jakarta embarks from addressing traffic congestion as one of the typical challenges faced by metropolitan cities in the world. And then in the past, economic growth in Jakarta stimulates the policy of car-oriented development by focusing on the development of roads for private vehicles, and public transport is less reliable. Then Jakarta administration transformed its policy to shift people from using private vehicles to public transportation through 3 strategies. So the first strategy is to transform from disintegrated to integrated public transport. So we are integrating the modes, routes, and tariffs through a system called Jaklingko. And the second is transformation from priority to motorized vehicle to non-motorized vehicle, such bikes and pedestrian. So we have been built pedestrian for 241 kilometers, bike lanes for 103 kilometers, and we also built a bike sharing spot in 67 places. And transformation from car-oriented development to transit-oriented development. And these strategies bring positive results. As you can see in the slide, that we actually doubled the annual ridership in 2 years from 2017 from 144 million passengers to 288 million passengers in 2019. And also our daily ridership is increased from 400,000 passengers per day in 2017, and in 2020 we reached 1 million passengers daily. But actually this is also hit by the COVID-19 pandemics, and the ridership was dropped in 2021. But I believe that this year the ridership is bounced back to the normal rate. And also, more public transport passengers mean less congestions and less emissions. And we achieve results from the most congested cities in the world, according to TomTom Traffic Index, in 2017, sorry. The third most congested cities in 2017, and then we dropped to rank 7 in 2018, then to rank 10, and now last year in 2021, we become the 46th most congested cities in the world. So I think this is the achievement by the investment of public transport, and the public transport network coverage is now doubled. It reached 82% of citizens living in Jakarta now having access within a walking distance to public transport mode. And also, we have this approach of the public transport integration of routes, modes, and tariffs through the participative and collaborative approach. We invite different stakeholders from private sectors, trade unions, experts, and community groups to come up with this idea of integrated transport network in Jakarta. And you know that this COVID-19 pandemics also impacting adversely on the ridership, as I mentioned earlier, and also we are having the huge funding gaps for investment in public transport in urban areas. So we emphasize more investment in public transport and call on the G20 and all the stakeholders to make transformative investment. The city needs to drive a green and just recovery, because public transport is creating many jobs and also tackling climate crisis.
Thank you, Enggar. I can only imagine the complexity of integrating the different modes of transport in terms of planning, delivery for a megalopole like Jakarta. So in terms of capacity building, things that we discussed and that feature in our toolkit, it's obviously a critical element. And it's a segue to my next question to you as a follow-up question, Enggar. What can we do in terms of aligning G20 and G20 engagement groups' efforts to scale up successful examples and stories like the ones that you've just described, and really put those examples in practice in other cities and regions? So please, Enggar.
Oh, well, thank you. So sustainable and a long-term investment in public transport and expansion is needed, actually, to help address the ongoing increase of energy, climate, and living costs in many regions in the world nowadays. And the benefit of investing in public transport is huge, as also discussed by the previous panel. It creates many new jobs and provide increased access to decent jobs, and also support energy security by reducing oil demand and provide better health, less emissions, and reduce living costs. So in tackling climate crisis, actually Jakarta is now electrifying our public buses fleet operated by Transjakarta. Transjakarta is the city-owned enterprise of Jakarta City Administration. And currently, we are having 30 electric buses in operations, and we targeted to have 100 electric buses in operation by this year. And also, we actually have a target to electrify all of our buses by 2030. This is the huge target and requires massive investment. And we, from the 2025 forwards, will procure only the electric buses. So this is some of the strategies now being adopted by the city of Jakarta. And then for the business model, the e-buses are actually purchased by private bus operators who have a contract with our city-owned enterprise, Transjakarta, and then the contract between the Transjakarta and the private bus operators is quality-based service level agreement. So the private bus operators provide services, and then our city-owned company, Transjakarta, paid the service based on the kilometer of each bus in operation. So this is the system. Actually, the investment for electric bus in Jakarta is conducted by the private sector. And also, apart from the farebox revenue and non-farebox revenues of Transjakarta, the city administration support the company, the city-owned company Transjakarta, through a subsidy in form of public service obligation. And to achieve the electrification of all fleet by 2030, the existing financing scheme fulfilled by the private bus operators, we believe should be improved, as the operators have limited financial capacity, and also the expansion requires massive investment. So innovative and affordable financing scheme for e-bus expansion should be developed by collaboration between the national, subnational government, and also private sector and other related stakeholders. So the model of e-bus expansion in Jakarta, from the initial phase to the financing scaling up, can then be used as a benchmark for other cities.
Thank you, Engel. Very, very convincing. I'd like to move to Arif. You talked about the enabling environment in general for infrastructure investment and the involvement of the private sector. If we move to concrete actions that could be taken to precisely unlock the vast amount of capital that is out there. I know that it's been a perennial issue in the G20. I've been in the G20 circuit for quite some years. So infrastructure as an asset class has been there on the agenda for quite some time. So what are the concrete actions that we can take?
Yeah, so maybe just to put some numbers into it so that we can pictorize, right? Right now, the cumulative gap for infrastructure financing, I believe, is around $3 trillion, right? And some projections suggest that it might grow into $15 trillion by 2040. That seems to be a lot, right? So that seems to be a lot. Now, having said that, the wealth that is created is probably more than ever right now. So if you look into just institutional wealth, right? So these are sovereign wealth fund, pension fund, insurance company. It is roughly $120 trillion by 2040, right? High net worth, super ultra high net worth individual like Julian here, right? If you calculate all of them, another 120 trillion, right? High net worth individual, plus some asset managers of rich people who is not as rich as Julian, another 100 trillion. So roughly $350 trillion of available commercial capital, right? And many of them are actually in our working group. And they really, if you compare that, 15 trillion seems to be a lot, but there are 350 trillion, at least 120 trillion from institutional investors in our working group, right? It's only 5%. And they want to invest in infrastructure. And at the end of the day, it probably boils down to how do we actually allocate between risk and return of many of these infrastructure projects. Some of the fundamentals, we'll talk about it, I'm not gonna repeat it, but the risk-return trade-off is extremely important. Earlier we talked about guarantees, but guarantees can take many forms. So more innovation in terms of how governments, be it national or subnational, can actually provide that certainty, the risk some of the risk. For example, through land clearance, if it is in the case of Indonesia, ensuring right-of-way, providing guarantees, traffic guarantees, demand guarantees, So many of these, if you really believe that the public needs it, it will come. But the private sector, the commercial capital, will not take it on its own, right? And I would like to steal 1 minute from your earlier comment to Julian, because we have actually, remember, 15 trillion gap, 120 trillion. And Julian has this, not only Julian, I think many people talk about blended finance, and rightfully so, you mentioned you would like to challenge that concept. Sounds good, right? Because you have private capital, 350 trillion, at least 120, and then you have governments who might be able to take some of those risks, and you have foundations, concessional finance, and so on and so forth. How big is the blended finance? 9 billion. It's not even trillion. 15, 350, actually 9 billion, right? It's just so far from what is actually needed. So obviously there is need for government to step into the risk, but we talk a lot about blended finance. We talk about how do we actually enhance and scale up. And for this one of the recommendations that we have in our policy paper is how do we enhance the role of the MDBs so that they can come in. That's what they're formed, or we hope so. So let me give you one real anecdote. We have three institutions, INA. We established a platform to recycle capital of some of the toll roads that the government had actually put forward through government budget. And we have these institutional investors, global institutional investors, willing to take 30, 50-year risk, right? And we do need to have some financing, not even blended financing, just traditional financing. And we talked to one MDB, it's not to be named. And the first question that they ask is, how do you hedge the currency risk? I have private capital willing to take 30, 50-year risk, and an MDB is asking, how do I hedge Indonesian rupiah? I was, okay, interesting, so might as well talk to commercial banks, right? So how do we make sure that the MDBs participate even more using different kind of scheme, not to crowd out commercial capital, right? They can provide guarantees. I know it's probably less profitable, probably, I don't know. But how do you actually step up from the 9 billion, maybe to double it or triple it in the next few years? And for that, obviously the G20, as you know, obviously the founders on some of these MDBs, is to actually allow that to happen, to make sure that it's actually for the lack of better words, the KPI of some of these institutions is not only about deployment of their capital, the ability to maintain their credit rating, but also the amount of commercial capital that is deployed to help the national government, the subnational government, to continue developing, infrastructure for the future. So sorry to steal, 2 minutes of your time, but anyways, but that's the big debate in the B20, and we hope to actually convey that again to the G20 in due course.
Thank you, Arif. And don't get me wrong, the OECD is actually a strong promoter of blended finance. We even came up with the Itacarata recommendation on blended finance with Indonesia. It was just for the sake of challenging Julian a bit. Julian, so you have 2 minutes less than your allotted 5 minutes, please. The floor is yours, and it's really to focus on the transition to low carbon infrastructure and how finance can be mobilized at the subnational level to achieve this goal. So please.
Thank you, Nicola. I just wanted to endorse some of the comments from Pak Enger on my right about, I've lived in Jakarta for 7 years, and I really have seen a transformation in that time. And it's not just public transport. I remember when I first came to Indonesia, people said, well, Indonesian people don't walk anywhere, they don't cycle anywhere. But it's not just the investment in public transport, but also the investment in the pedestrian domain, where I discovered actually Indonesian people are perfectly happy to walk if they know they won't fall in a hole at the side of the road. And the center of Jakarta is really, you don't recognize it as a city compared with when I came here a few years ago. And the traffic congestion really has got better as well. So that is a good model that other countries can learn from. But one of the things I want to mention, going to your question, is I talked earlier about blended finance as a partnership between concessional and private capital. But I think one of the keys to local government sustainable investment is the partnership with national government, because most local governments do not have the resources. So we have the first MRT line in Jakarta and 2 LRT lines. Both the MRT and the LRT benefited from some funding from national government and indeed international institutions in a way that, and it enabled Jakarta to do something even as sort of the wealthiest province it could not have probably done on its own. But it was a partnership because it was properly planned and implemented at local level, taking account of the needs of the inhabitants of Jakarta. And of course, that is part of the transition to a low-carbon economy because it's enabling people to get out of their cars and use public transport. It's also contributing to improved air quality and health outcomes, not just reduced traffic congestion. Moving on to other green projects, I think one of the challenges with green projects, so in both of these sessions today, we've heard a lot about project preparation. As soon as you bring in another objective, i.e. reduce carbon emissions, which we're still really only at the early stages of working out how to monetize the benefit of reduced carbon emissions. You know, some countries have carbon markets, Indonesia's developing it, but if you rely on the revenue from carbon offsets, it automatically makes the project more complex. So it reinforces all the earlier messages about the need for thorough project preparation, the opportunity for blended finance, because it's difficult to say, you know, today, what would be the price of carbon in 10 years' time, but actually we want investors to take risk on that because they will get a benefit from it. The other point may be, I mentioned my experience as a councillor. What you do find in local government is each subnational government has 1 or 2 big projects they need to do, especially if it's outside the capital city. And if each of them has to learn how to do projects on their only big project, you do not get the right outcome. So national government and multilaterals really have to do they can't do enough to support the capacity building and investing in the capability and making sure that subnational governments have got the expertise to deliver those projects. And again, it's multiplied if it's a decarbonisation project. I think the last point maybe I want to make is that, a couple more points. One of the easy things I think subnational governments can do is prepare their own net zero transition plans. What I see is a lot of discussion about how the private sector must decarbonise, and sometimes both national and local governments may be behind the game in working out how they control their own carbon emissions. And they're really in a position to set example to the rest of the economy. And then finally, we've talked a lot about, not just in our B20 task force, but in many other fora this year, about working towards a just transition. And of course, any of the projects that are being promoted need to, going back to my very early quickfire point, take account of all the stakeholders, excluded groups who might be affected by any project, whether it's, a public transport project may be a good thing for those who are going to use it, but whoever is living on the land that's going to be converted to public transport is going to have to be moved somewhere else. And sometimes the planning doesn't take proper account of those people's interests. So going back to my very first comment about respecting the frameworks for environmental and social aspects.
Thank you, Julian, and cannot agree more with you on the need to have clear policy signals going forward, especially when it comes to the price of carbon, be it explicit or implicit pricing of carbon, of course. Critical for infrastructure investment over a long period of time. I'd like to move to Joissa. Joissa, you focused very much at the start of your, during the rapid fire round, on governance. So could you elaborate on this, and how in particular could we create partnerships among local governments, central governments, but also multilateral institutions and private institutions, of course, to enable efficient, sustainable and inclusive infrastructure investments? Please.
So improved governance is a critical enabler of partnerships that will deliver efficient, sustainable, and inclusive infrastructure investment at a subnational level. It encompasses common goals and complementarity of tools and resources to address imbalances, risks, and the course of action in the presence of unforeseen events. By governance, I mean a multi-layer and multi-level governance framework whose principles rely on tools, say capacity building, human resources and capital, clarity of roles in regulation and policies, transparency, predictability, and accountability of decision-making. This concept might be easy to state, but it's challenging to implement and maintain. Measuring, monitoring, and benchmarking good governance are useful tools to deliver improved governance. OECD is a strong promoter of benchmarking governance and regulatory governance as well. This reinforces the importance of improved governance adapted to cope with the risks and transformations we have experienced. Another enabler that I would like to point is resilience. So the last 3 years have significantly increased our ability to understand shocks and risks and the importance of developing and delivering resilience. This is at the core of our discussions at the Task Force 8 at G20. So we increasingly need projects that address resilience right at the beginning by design, and that are able to reduce the magnitude, the impacts, and the duration of disruptive events such as cyber threats, extreme weather events, supply chain and business models disruptions, and security of supply of energy and water. Delivering resilience is challenging and costly, particularly to cities and regions that still face infrastructure gaps and in which resilience often comes at a cost to accelerate access to people and communities. So state-of-the-art metrics, data, models, and tools are critical to make a strong business case to support investments in resilient infrastructure.
Thank you, Joysa. And this issue of data when it comes to infrastructure is also a central one, as we know, and has been traditionally high on the agenda of the G20. Christina, I started with you. I'm wrapping up with you. So, what action, in your capacity also of IWG co-chair, what action do you expect the G20 and G20 governments individually to take, which align with the policy toolkit that I mentioned in my introduction? And yes, how this toolkit can be used, mainstreamed, and will not sit on the shelf of the G20 as it happens sometimes to reports to the G20, please.
Well, thank you. I will try and be quite quick. And I just want to bring it back a little bit to the basics and not to repeat. And I agree with everything I've heard so far, so I'll try and take a slightly different slant on what I want to wrap up with. I guess in terms of investment, we all know, let's face it, governments won't invest in something that won't contribute to productivity, doesn't have a good economic return. So really bringing it back to the basics. We won't get financing if it's not really financially viable for the private sector or investors to invest in. So I mean, that's loud and clear. So I think we need to start from the basics. The second key point is around capacity building, and how do we actually do that intentionally. So I want to focus on the 4 key areas. The first one is around innovation, and I want to take a slightly different slant. It's not about the private sector, it's not about the financing, looking at financing innovation, but innovation in terms of how we pitch for projects and how do we actually, looking at subnational governments, how do we actually plan in an innovative way? And I think, Julian, you talked about, local governments, some of the smaller subnational governments not having capacity to be loud enough in their own right or have a strong voice. And I think that's where I think coalition across, lots of these smaller government areas, and I think I touched on in my earlier comment, in terms of planning and being really innovative and being intentional in planning is really important. Strength in numbers, I think, and not just to get financing, but to actually get a really good economic return. So I'll make it into a quick example. I think it always helps with an example. So if a local government area is looking for a bridge upgrade, whereas if you're looking at a supply chain, if you're looking at where the network is, and if you're looking at access issues for heavy vehicles, you might want to partner up with 10 other local governments to look at supply chain issues and put a business case together in that way that will be a lot more impactful, I think, have a much bigger impact and potentially much bigger economic returns as well. Secondly, we talked a lot about coordination between governments, across governments. I think incentives is really key there. Nobody wants to do anything without incentives, really. So I think, and again, I'll put it into an example. In Australia, we developed what we call city deals and regional deals, and they're deals between all three levels of government as well as industry and private sector. In some cases, that they actually sign on a dotted line with a limited time frame to achieve, whether it's a policy outcome, whether it's an investment outcome, whether it's governance or reform of some sort, where and it's different depending on the different region and the cities. So one of the examples is in Western Australia, we have what we call the MetroNet project. It's a public transport rail project where it's a part of a city deal with the federal government, the Western Australian government and local governments to come together and long-term planning for this public transport rail project that looks at a coordination across planning agency. They developed a big office that had everybody in one office, so the Treasury representatives as well as transport representatives as well as planning, and it hasn't ever been done like that before, and they all worked for this project. They looked at value capture, they looked at different staging of the network over the next 20 years, and that had incentives and as it went through the stages from different levels of government. So that kind of model may not work for everybody, but I think incentives is really key. And quickly on the third one is around skills. We've talked a lot about skills and capacity building, but I wanted to, again, take a slightly different slant on that, and not just the skills in delivery, but I think skills in developing business cases is really important, especially for subnational governments who may or may not be familiar with how to pitch something, how to write a good business case that is consistent, and having the right modelling done to be able to present evidence-based data, I think is really important. And then lastly, timing. I think timing is everything in terms of sequencing and planning, and whether that means, for very mega big projects, whether you might want to look at staging so that your timing of when to pitch for projects, it's key to everything in terms of when you will get the best return on investment, and when the governments or private sector will likely to be investing in. And I'll stop there.
So thanks to all the speakers. I know that we are slightly behind schedule, 10 minutes, but we started late. So I don't know if there is, let's say, a pressing question from the audience, one or two, something that keep you awake at night, please. Sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Ade Safrudin from Bandung Institute of Technology. My background is transportation. So when we are talking about the role of subnational or local government in Indonesia, we are not talking about Jakarta. We are talking about more than 34 provinces and more than 500 cities or districts. So if we compare them, there is a wide range of many aspects between Jakarta and other locals in terms of course, money, public or private, expertise or human capital, and the regulatory framework and so on. Maybe we can say that Jakarta has the money, has the expertise, has the institutional capacity and so on. But most of other local government in Indonesia maybe has nothing compared to Jakarta. I just remember that some years ago, Bandung and Surabaya tried to propose public transport, mass public transport for the city to the PPP framework, but that also proposed some of the capital support from the central government, but it didn't work. They didn't get the support from the central government, and just simply the project stopped there. And so the issue is maybe not only the lack of the capital and the human capital and the expertise and so on. Maybe the basic issue is the understanding of the local governments on how to proceed with the promoting private participation in the infrastructure development and how to execute or proceed with the plan. So it will be interesting, I think, if we can hear some of the experience from Christina or Joisa. Experience, you can share some experience from Australia or from Brazil, how to address this issue. Thank you very much.
So Christina and Joisa, very quickly, because actually we were told not to open the Q&A session. so Christina in 1 minute and Joisa 1 minute as well. Okay. So yeah, it's examples of capacity building from national to central governments to local. The example being a project where this transfer of expertise was not successful in Indonesia. So how to do that in an efficient manner?
I think I'll be really quick. I do refer back to the couple of examples I've given before on the capacity building. I think one of the ones, a big example that came to mind is we had a PPP in a regional area of Australia in the mountain ranges in Queensland. And that was one good example where, and it was actually a foreign consortia that won the contract, and working in not a remote area, but in a geologically complex project with large tunneling and all of that kind of the issues. So in terms of capacity building, I have to revert back to the procurement structure of that particular project and the PPP arrangement that we had, where we wrote it into the contract for the consortia, before the consortia was built, is to have the capability building, having a long-term plan in terms of, because it was a PPP with a long-term maintenance and servicing arrangements for 30 years as well. So I think what we did was we built it into the procurement side of things to, again, look at targets, look at skilling up, and there were a few, can't remember the word of it now, but working with some of the local educational universities and things to look at skilling up and traineeships and things like that as well. I'll be really quick.
Maybe last word to Joisa, very succinct.
Thanks for the question. There is an experience in Brazil, recent water reform approved 2 years ago, set a new role for the federal regulator that empowers this regulator to set guidelines, enforce and monitor the ability of subnational regulators to advance water and sanitation access. And connected to this, as Ms. Azevedo presented in the previous panel, the National Development Bank has worked extensively in the design and preparation of projects and concessions on water, something that has allowed us to significantly attract capital to fill one of the major gaps that we have in infrastructure. This is a way to cope with the divide that was presented by the participant in the audience, and that is very important, very severe, and innovative solutions can address that.
Thank you, Joisa. So we will, I'm going to wrap up now without a proper wrap-up, but just to really see that many of the aspects that were discussed today are actually captured in this policy toolkit that will be delivered to the G20. So it's pretty reassuring, in fact. And I just would like to ask for a round of applause to the speakers. I think it was a very rich discussion. So thanks to everyone.
Thank you very much to our panelists and to Mr. Nicola Pina for moderating this session. Once again, please give big round of applause for our discussion today. Okay, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we will conclude today's seminar with a closing remarks by Bapak Haris Munandar, Director, Head of International Policy Group, Central Bank of Indonesia. Bapak Haris Munandar, please kindly come to the stage.
Very good afternoon to you all. I will be very brief. It gives me a great pleasure to conclude this seminar with the closing remarks. Seminar, a collaborative effort between the Indonesian G20 presidency and a number of excellent engagement groups also from G20. This time, Business 20, Think 20, and also Urban 20. On behalf of the Indonesian G20 presidency, once again, I would like to thank our panelists for advancing our discussion on how we can achieve a more sustainable and inclusive infrastructure investment, and also to all audience for the participation. Today's seminar is a significant avenue for the public and private sectors to strengthen our collaboration further to mobilize private capital while delivering an inclusive economic recovery. This is because of the strong complementarity between G20 working groups and G20 engagement groups, which allows us to ensure a more holistic approach in delivering infrastructure investment as one of the most critical elements in the development. The sustainable infrastructure itself can significantly contribute to unleashing the medium and long-term economic growth potential, and at the same time meet global climate targets. Further, the inclusivity aspect will also help the most needed in accessing and utilizing the infrastructure to help them perform their daily activities and to participate in the economy. The G20, particularly the Infrastructure Working Group, recognizes the crucial role of infrastructure for recovery and enhancing social inclusion. However, the challenge of closing the infrastructure gap is enormous, and we should be working together to address the global challenge. What matters now is how we can support the investment in the needed space and scale, particularly in sustainable and inclusive infrastructure. Many have expressed views, experiences, and ideas in the seminar on how to promote and attract more infrastructure investments that are sustainable, inclusive, accessible, and affordable, noting some challenges ahead, both from pandemic and also structural impediments. In this context, let me point out 3 key messages as takeaways from today's seminar. First, we need to better understand the opportunities and challenges at the national level, subnational levels, and even the local community. This comprehensive understanding will guide us toward a better action, which must be concrete, practical, and considering local context. Second, we should address the sustainability issue from a broader perspective, from macro, meso, and later on micro, while ensuring access and financial needs. We need to ensure that the work in sustainable infrastructure financing is undertaken along with managing transition risks and improving accessibility and affordability of the financing instruments. In this sense, providing access to financing will need to be complemented with capacity development to ensure the long-term sustainability of the development program and the financing itself. Third, the collaborative nature will need to be at the heart of all the approaches, especially at the G20. To this extent, we need to continue strengthening our collaboration to ensure that we tackle financing challenges for subnational governments, while at the same time helping nationals toward its plan to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Finally, today's seminar has demonstrated many ways to improve the enabling environment to support sustainable and inclusive infrastructure investment. Given the limited room for public financing, private-public partnership has become more critical than ever. Thus, I hope today's discussion will provide a strong foundation on how G20 set the course of action for an ambitious yet clear collective actions. I will stop here and thank you all for your valuable contribution to this seminar. For those of you who will attend the meeting tomorrow, I will see you tonight at the Prambanan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bapak Haris Munandar, for the closing remark. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we have had productive and inspiring time together, and we now come to the end of Advancing Sustainable and Inclusive Infrastructure Investment, a collaborative seminar between the Indonesian G20 Presidency and G20 Engagement Groups, Business 20, Think 20, and Urban 20. Before I close this seminar, let me remind to all delegates and committees who will join welcoming dinner at Prambanan Temple. After the seminar, please kindly gather at the ballroom lobby to prepare the departure. Once again, let me remind to all delegates and committees who will join welcoming dinner at Prambanan Temple. After the seminar, please kindly gather at the ballroom lobby to prepare the departure. On behalf of the host and the committee, we'd like to extend our deepest appreciation to you all for your support and participation. I am Dudi Septariza. Good evening and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.